Welcome to Dave and Mackey Photography, where we talk all things photography and Photoshop. Today we're going to go over some essential features and settings in Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop to help streamline your workflow. Moving right along. So I'm not going to go over all of the settings in Photoshop because that would be Adobe's job. But if you want to follow along with my photography content and tutorials, then these are the settings to pay attention to. I hope this is easy to follow along, and if you want me to make a more expanded episode about any of these topics, I would be more than happy to. I'm always happy to hear about content ideas. So we've opened up Photoshop, and the first thing we're going to do is set up our workspace. If it's your first time opening up Photoshop, usually what you'll see is Photoshop Essentials. There are two different ways that you can change that, and that's through the window and workspace and photography. Alternatively, you can go up to the window icon in the top right hand corner and select photography. For your histograms here, you'll see channel. RGB is the default. I like to have colors. Colors allows me to analyze the color balance of the image. Even though I have a really nice monitor that is 98+% of sRGB and it's 10 nit HDR, blah blah blah, I go off the numbers because not everyone is going to have the same display, and not all printers are equal. So it's just a matter of quality control, and in future episodes we'll discuss analyzing images by tone using a zone system. It's breaking tones down into zones, and so this histogram is going to help you do that. To get some more data on the histogram, we'll go to Show Statistics, and that's going to give us our levels. And those levels correspond to the levels that you see in the color picker. So we'll use the color sampler tool, and I've already have a black here sampled, and so you can see 10, 9, 8 for RGB, and that corresponds to the blacks. And so if I right click on the histogram, it prints out a level. And so the highlighted section corresponds to the blacks. If I were to select the leaf, I can see 178, 199, and 63. So that gives me the color balance and also the luminosity. It is a highlight, and so I can actually select that range of the histogram and see what zone that it falls into. That's kind of a cool way of expressing yourself with tone and also doing some quality control on your photographs. I can't say how many times I've processed a photograph. I know what I think looks good, but then I'll share it with the internet and then look at it with my cell phone and not really appreciate the output. So if I'm analyzing the luminosity and the colors using the histogram and the color picker tool, then I'm setting myself up for success regardless of what display. Keeping in mind that people are using adaptive brightness displays. Usually they're handheld devices like an Android or an iPhone or something like that, or they're using a gaming monitor, so there's color shifting and things like that happens. So being able to look at tone and color objectively is really important to me. So the next thing we're going to do, since we've got our workspace set up, we'll look at other things like we've got our histogram selected already, adjustments selected, so that's your curves and hue and saturation and all those classic Photoshop adjustments. And then we've got paths, and so channels, layers. So we can see that now that layers is the tab that's open. Layers is checked here. Good so far? Good. So the next thing we'll do is we'll go to color settings. Color settings. So I have custom settings. If I were to go to, I can't remember what the default is, but for RGB, I work with ProPhoto RGB. It's a wider gamut than sRGB, and I prefer to start with more information, as much information as I can from raw to post-production. CMYK, this is the default setting. This is what I use. Gray and spot are basically how Photoshop analyzes levels, going back to the histogram, in respect to 20% gray, which is a midtone. Conversion options. I actually use a different process in my conversion, but the engine Adobe Photoshop is the default. It should be noted that some third-party applications, like you'll see that I've got some third-party extensions here, will request that you change these settings. I have let them at default, just as I'm used to using those dot grain settings as is, and I'm afraid of having to readapt. So there it is. The next thing we'll go into is our preferences. So you'll see that it says General and then Interface, Workspace, Tools, etc. If you just hit General, it opens up all of those menus, and then you can tab through them here. Most of these I leave at default, but there are a few of them that I think are important. Color Picker, Adobe, that's the default. Let's see here. Yeah, I don't use any of these guys. Interface is basically aesthetic customizations for your window. Workspace, I leave those at default. Tools, I leave most of these at default. Gestures and things like that are for like using Windows Ink or a touchpad or something like that. Show tooltips, that by default is on, but you might want to turn that off if you get annoyed with Photoshop trying to give you an introduction on how the paintbrush works. This is the place to turn that off. History and content, this is for auditing and where you want a log of your edits to be stored. It's very forensic. I don't use it. Let's see here. File saving options, I leave that as default. As far as exporting files and things like that, I have a separate workflow that is going to be the topic of another YouTube video. File compatibility, raw preferences, we'll come back to this because I think that's a separate thing, but that'll be in this episode. Prefer Adobe Camera Raw for supported RAW files. I open my RAW files through Adobe Bridge, and so this is going to be selected. Use Adobe Camera Raw to convert documents from 32-bit to 16 to 8-bit. This is really important if you want to use ACR to do like HDR type work. So if that's something that interests you, or you're going to be following along with my photo tutorials, this is going to be a useful button to push. Everything else I have on default. Let's see, for exporting, again, these are all default settings because I have manual. I tend to control everything in a different way that I'll show you in a different episode. For performance, I let Photoshop use 70%. It never gets that high as 3.5 or 35 gigs, but it easily gets up to 50%. Doing work for multiple hours, it will fill up 50% of my 64 gigs of RAM with just Photoshop, Bridge, ACR, and a couple of tabs open on Google Chrome. that happens really easily. So if Photoshop is running slow, fast RAM is going to be your go-to upgrade. Use graphics processor. I have that selected. There are only a few things that I've noticed that a graphics processor helps in Photoshop. In Adobe Camera Raw, it seems to speed things up a little bit because it uses the GPU for its Bayer pattern interpolation. But the tools in Photoshop like smoothing and mask refining and things like that happen a little bit snappier with a GPU upgrade. History and states. This is cache levels and tile size. I leave at default. This is appropriate for photographers that are using many layers and masks and things like that. This cache levels 4. A lower setting corresponds to more layers. Higher settings correspond to a higher file size. I shoot with a camera that's close to 50 megapixels. I haven't found a need to change the cache levels. History states I have set at 50, which seems to be a happy medium. I've never had to go back 50 history states, but I do use history states a lot, and so it's a nice feature. But it's also nice to know that that's there if your Photoshop is running slowly, because you can reduce your history states to speed things up and save RAM. Image processing. These can be useful. This is a default setting here. Selection processing, you can either go faster or more stable. I haven't touched these, but if you want more accurate results, you can switch to more stable. And this corresponds to things like using the wand tool or refined mask tool. It's just more resource intensive to use the stability feature. Scratch disks. Scratch disks is really important for Photoshop speed. It's where it stores temporary information that's not stored in RAM. I use an NVMe SSD. I've got, I like to keep at least 100 gigabytes free on it at any time, so that I have an ample amount of room to read and write quickly. You'll see that I have this E drive here, which is almost 7 gigabytes in size, and that's a spinning rust hard drive that I use for saving all my videos and photos. And so since that's slower, it's less efficient as a scratch disk. A lot of these other settings are aesthetic. Units and rulers is one that is actually a really important one. Print resolution, the way this works, 300 dpi. In theory, the human eye can't see a finer resolution than 300 dpi, so it seems to be an industry standard. I can see the dots, but that's by the by. The way it works is if your units and type and your column size is inches and gutter inches, rulers inches, then it takes the pixels of your image and divides it by the resolution, and it gives you how many inches by how many inches is your photograph, which is absolutely important if you plan on printing these. Because one thing that you'll run into, especially as a novice, is you'll send this off to the printer, and the printer is going to say, how do you want me to crop this image? And that's a terrible thing to hear from a printer. So you can either print a small image on a large piece of paper or crop the image onto the dimensions that you want to print. And neither one of those are ideal. You want to make sure that your images are cropped to the specific dimensions that you want to print at. This is the setting for you. Did you get that? It's important. Everything else is kind of aesthetic. Don't use that. Don't use 3D for anything, and really don't like any kind of participating in improvement programs or any kind of dialog boxes that pop up with Adobe Photoshop crashes. So there's that for Photoshop, or at least those are the settings that are important to me. The next thing we'll do is we'll go into Adobe Camera Raw. There are 3 different ways to do this. So the first way is the way that we skipped over previously, and that's going to be in Preferences, and that's going to be File Handling, Camera Raw Preferences. Alternatively, you can also go into Bridge, Edit, Camera Raw Preferences, or you can open up a RAW file, and on the bottom of Adobe Camera Raw, you'll see this highlighted bit down here. Just click on that. So in a lot of these I leave as default settings. But in workflow, I have this set as ProPhoto RGB, so it's the same color space as I use in Photoshop, and that's actually really important to keep those the same. The reason why is that you might be making color adjustments or luminosity adjustments or saturation adjustments that change the hue enough to where you'll see an image that you like in Adobe Camera Raw. You open it up in Post or Photoshop, and the colors shift, or they look significantly different. And when switching between color spaces, you don't want to do it in between raw processing and Photoshop. Make that the last thing you do. If you want to convert to sRGB, do that before you save the image for uploading to Facebook or whatever. 16 bits per channel. Basically, I am telling Adobe Camera Raw to take full advantage of the bit depth of my RAW file. There doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to reduce the bit depth of your DSLR or your mirrorless camera that you spent, your hard-earned money on. Take full advantage of that. Image sizing, that's I don't resize to fit. Resolution, it's always going to be the same. It's going to be pixels per inch, and it's going to be the same in ACR as it is in Adobe Photoshop. Output sharpening, by default this is actually turned on. I highly recommend that you turn that off. I'll have a separate episode for sharpening, but basically you don't want any kind of artificial sharpening on a raw image, because it makes your photo look nice, but like, how sharp is it really? So unselect that. And then the last thing is open in Photoshop as a smart object. You want to have that selected. Basically what happens is if I open the object, it opens in a separate tab, and you'll see in layers there's this, it kind of looks like a piece of paper that's dog-eared. I can double click this and it opens it back up in Adobe Camera Raw. So it's not just a regular layer, it's a smart layer. Also, the interesting thing about smart layers is I can make edits to it, and it basically has history states that are saved. So like if I were to resize this to a smaller size, I could resize it back to its original size and not lose image quality as a smart object. As a rasterized object, if I were to resize it to a smaller size and then resize it to its original size, you would have a lot of loss in detail as a result of that. And so instead, you would have to go back into your history states and rewind. So smart objects can be really handy in that way. There are also a lot of other clever things that you can do with smart objects that I'll talk about in future episodes. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, and I hope this was useful to you. I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and if you have any comments, don't be ashamed to drop them down below.